Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Panelino Bambino Top 5 list. So today we're going to be doing the sort of parallel list to the previous one I did. That one was looking at the characters that improved the most in sort of utility and usability between Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn. Today we're going to be looking at the opposite, to the units that got really bad between Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn. Now, I felt pretty good about the previous list. This one, part of the problem with looking at the units is that Radiant Dawn's a game where availability is a huge part of why characters are good or bad. And I don't think it's super fun to talk about characters that were like good in Path of Radiance, but are essentially just not available in Radiant Dawn. But that's just kind of how it is. So I've kind of tried to make some of these units more available units, but a lot of them are going to be just talking about availability. So hopefully it's still interesting. But this is largely going to be a list that's just talking about how bad the availability of a lot of units are and how they ruin a lot of characters in Radiant Dawn. So I hope it'll still be entertaining. All right, so just like last time, we're going to be doing a handful of honorable mentions, and then we'll be doing a top five. Like I said at the top of this, there are a lot of characters that are just sort of ruined by availability issues. This Stefan, of course, being one of them. But I'm going to mention them because I actually think Stefan is a pretty solid unit in Path of Radiance. He is a Swordmaster, which, as I said last time, is just a really bad class, but he has really high speed, pretty high strength, and his defense and overall bulk is not too bad, at least for a while. In fact, his speed is so good that he's even doubling into the late game. So, as bad a class as Swordmaster is, giving you immediate value in how strong he is when he's first recruited is enough to actually make him a pretty good unit. And unfortunately, in Radiant Dawn, he's just recruited too late to be useful. He's recruited essentially like halfway through the second Micaiah chapter of part four, which is like the last chapter of the game before you go to the tower. His stats aren't like terrible, and it is kind of cool that he gets to use the SS rank sword. But the truth is, like, it's really hard to find room for him at the tower. So he's essentially not a unit in the game. It's not very exciting because, again, he's not like necessarily a terrible unit. He's just recruited so late, but he is quite good in Path of Radiance, so I wanted to mention him here. So next up we have Tormund and Merim, or Morium, or I think it's Merim. I'm never 100% sure how to say his name. But in any case, these units are also pretty shafted by availability in Radiant Dawn. In fact, to the point where I would probably say that these two and then Vika, who's kind of the third one of their group, maybe get the most screwed over by availability when it comes to Radiant Dawn. They're recruited about halfway through the Dawn Brigade chapters of part one. They're usable for the rest of those chapters and not recruited again until essentially the second to last chapter before you go to the tower because they're recruited on the second Ground Mercenaries chapter of part four. And let me tell you, they are not good at that stage in the game. Although Morim actually is still okay at that stage. The biggest reason that I don't have these two higher, there's two reasons. Number one, they're not the best in Path of Radiance. Tormund is arguably the best mage in the end because of celerity, which gives him two more movement. But he's recruited a lot later than Ilyana and Soren, so I think he's quite a bit worse. And then Mirim is a fine unit, but I think probably worse than Mordecai and Lethe. And then in Radiant Dawn, this is the other reason I don't actually think they're that bad. Just because when you're usable for like half of the Dawn Brigade chapters, you actually have some decent utility because the Dawn Brigade is so bad. At the end of the Dawn Brigade chapters, you get like Nyla and the Black Knight and stuff, but there's still a few chapters where Torment and Murim are actually really good, like the chapter you recruit them on, or the Swamp chapter, stuff like that. So I do think they get really shafted in Radiant Dawn, but I don't think that they're um, quite good enough in Path of Radiance or bad enough for Radiant Dawn to warrant any higher on this list. And next up, we have Kieran and Makalov. So I mentioned that the sort of trifecta of Mirim, Tormund, and Vika are some of the most shafted units as far as availability goes in all of Radiant Dawn, and I still stand by this. But arguably, the other sort of group of units that also get really shafted by availability are the Crimean Knights. These units are deployable for one chapter in part two, technically also Alencia's Gambit, although they're not spectacular in that chapter, and then one chapter in part three, and then they're finally recruited toward the end of part three by the mercenaries. But it definitely makes them quite bad. The reason that these two are not higher or in my top five is because in Makalov's case, he's really bad on the Crimean Knights, but he's also not like the best in Path of Radiance. He is still a paladin, which means he has the busted Canto skill, but he's not nearly as good as basically all the other Cavs or paladins in the game. So while he's still a decent unit in Path of Radiance, he's not spectacular, even though he is really bad in Radiant Dawn. Kieran, on the other hand, is one of the very best units in Path of Radiance, but he's actually still okay in Radiant Dawn, given that him and Jeffrey are definitely the best two units on the Crimean Knights, and he's basically, along with Jeffrey, the only unit that can still do okay during their Part 3 chapter, and is potentially okay as well, especially if you tempo promote him for Part 4. So that's why I don't have them higher, but they definitely do get shafted because of availability. All right, and starting our top five list, or our actual top five, we have Lethe. So Lethe is a really good unit in Path of Radiance. She's recruited fairly early along with Mordecai. She transforms immediately on maps, which is great. She's a ton of movement. Her stats are really strong to begin with. Cats are kind of weird in Path of Radiance. They're not quite as like extreme on speed and skill as they are in Radiant Dawn, which I think really helps her because she doubles really consistently. She takes hits really well, and she hits pretty hard. She does sort of fall off as the game progresses, and I think in the end Mordecai is probably a better unit, but she's better than him I think for a while, and she's a really good unit. Unfortunately, in Radiant Dawn, Lagoos just kind of get shafted. You do have stuff like the Alibi Glass to kind of help you stay in Lagoos form longer, but it's just kind of a pain to deal with them. And they have all the same problems they did in Path of Radiance with not having two range and stuff like that. Uh, Now, I did mention Mordecai, and he's not on this list at all, but you could probably have Mordecai in here as well. The reason I don't have Mordecai in here is because I think he's worse than Lethe in Path of Radiance, and I think he's actually pretty good during Part 2 in Radiant Dawn. Whereas Lethe, I think, is really good in Path of Radiance, and it's just kind of bad wherever you have her in Radiant Dawn. The nice thing about her is her availability isn't terrible. Same thing with Mordecai, and she is fairly useful during Part 2, but she's worse than pretty much every other unit. And again, Lagoos are just so bad in Radiant Dawn, unfortunately. But I do think she's actually quite good, as I said, in Path of Radiance. So I think she deserves her number 5 spot. And I'll just touch on Mordecai. I know I mentioned him, but potentially could also be here. I thought about putting him with Lethe, but I think again he's worse in Path of Radiance and better in Radiant Dawn. Maybe he should be an honorable mention. Not really sure, but I think Lethe sort of exemplifies being worse between games a little bit better. Coming in at number 4, we have Oscar. So Oscar is maybe a controversial pick because he's actually not that bad in Radiant Dawn. But the reason that I have him on here is because he is one of the very best units in Path of Radiance. Top 5 at least, probably top 5, probably about 5th. He's recruited really early. He's an amazing class, got great stats, just a great unit in Path of Radiance. In Radiant Dawn, and this is why it's potentially a little controversial, he's not a terrible unit. The only reason that I would say he's pretty bad in Radiant Dawn is because he's kind of the like tier 2 of the ground mercenaries. So I mentioned last time when we talked about like why Mia is so special because she stands out in the ground mercenaries. Oscar kind of doesn't. In the ground mercenaries you have like Ike, Mia, Titania, Gatry, Shinon, just a bevy of really strong units. And then you have kind of the tier 2 units, and those are like Boyd, Soren, Oscar, who just aren't as good. Soren is another one who I think could very well be on this list. But I think Oscar is better in Path of Radiance, so to sort of show off that type of unit, I decided to do Oscar instead of Soren. But yeah, unfortunately, he's just he's not bad in Path of Radiance, or sorry, he's not bad in Radiant Dawn. He's just not that great, and he's really good in Path of Radiance. So this is also kind of a nod to I didn't want all of the units on this list to be just availability issue units. And Oscar definitely doesn't have availability issues in Radiant Dawn. So does he belong at number 4? Maybe not, but I thought it'd be kind of a fun nod to units that don't have availability problems, but did actually get quite a bit worse. Coming in at number 3, we have Tanith. So Tanith is one of the very best units in Path of Radiance. And there's a few reasons for this. Her class is great. She just has pretty good stats to begin with. She's a pretty good combat unit, but the big reason she's so good is because she has a reinforced skill. It's pretty rare in Fire Emblem games that a unit has a skill or an ability that allows you to summon reinforcements. She can summon basically two groups of 3 Pegasus Knights, one of which is a Falcon Knight. These units are awesome. They're actually pretty strong for a while, especially these Silverlance Falcon Knight. And then in the end game, they can do really good at like distracting stuff like that. It's just a busted ability. And again, her combat is also not bad. Definitely one of the best units in Path of Radiance. In Radiant Dawn, however, Tanith, again, her availability isn't terrible. Unfortunately, Pegasus Knight is not as good of a class. Bows are really scary, and crossbows are really scary. Her stats aren't terrible. Part of her problem as well is that she comes with Sigrun, who's a playable unit in Radiant Dawn. And Sigrun is like stronger in basically every way. She's about to promote a much easier promotion, and Sigrun is honestly even not that good. So Tanith, you can certainly promote both, but unfortunately Tanith is just not that good in Radiant Dawn. And she's definitely one of the best characters in Path of Radiance. Coming in at number two, we have another Pegasus slash Falcon Knight, and that is Marcia. So this is for sort of a similar reason. Marcia actually in Radiant Dawn has sort of the same availability trajectory as the Crimean Knights. She's available on a little bit more or a few more chapters. The first chapter of part two, for example, and she's also a little bit she's deployed a little bit earlier on Alencia's Gambit, the final chapter of part two, but she's only basically available on the Crimean Knights chapters, and unfortunately, she's just not very good in Radiant Dawn. She's okay on that first chapter, like most of the Crimean Knights, but she's not very good on the second one. And when she's finally recruited by the mercenaries, she's just really weak. Juxtapose that with Path of Radiance, where Marcia is one of the best units in the whole game. Just like I mentioned, she has a busted class, busted Canto in that game. She's recruited perhaps slightly late, but still earlier than a lot of the other really busted units like Jill and of course Tanith. I also like that she has kind of a little bit more balance between resistance and defense than someone like Jill, although they're both great units. The point is she's amazing in Path of Radiance and quite bad in Radiant Dawn. And finally, coming in at number one, we have, in my opinion, the worst character in all of Radiant Dawn, and that is Astrid. I absolutely hate Astrid in Radiant Dawn. She's completely and utterly useless. She has all the availability problems that I mentioned with the Knights, but she sort of transcends that because even a character like Makalov, who's not great, can at least offer some combat. Astrid can't offer anything. Astrid is so bad that on that first part two chapter, when you fight the first sort of wave of enemies, that are all unpromoted. Basically, all the Crimean Knights look good, and that's I think part of the point is like they're supposed to look pretty good. Astrid doesn't. She looks terrible. She's absolutely terrible. In Path of Radiance, Astrid is not one of the very best units, but still a very good unit. Which is kind of funny because Astrid doesn't look very good in Path of Radiance, but she has the Paragon skill, which you can't take off her trade. That, in conjunction with the Knight's Ward, makes her really easy to train and basically gives her guaranteed just a ton of speed, which is pretty amazing. And you get to use axes when you promote, so being bow locked is really not that bad. Not even a thing once she promotes. So, yeah, I mean, potentially characters like Tanith and Marcia being better in Path of Radiance should maybe make them number one. But for me, Astrid is the worst character in Radiant Dawn. She's absolutely terrible, and she's quite good in Path of Radiance. So easy number one for me with Astrid. And finally, I just want to thank everybody for watching. As always, I had a lot of fun making this list, just like I had a lot of fun making the previous one. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, you think this was great, you think this was terrible, there are units that potentially you think should be on here, feel free to comment below. The last video actually had a decent amount of comments, and whether I agreed with you or disagreed with you, I had a lot of fun talking about kind of my perspective and learning about other people's perspective when it comes to characters, and who should potentially be on lists or who should not be on lists. I think that kind of stuff is great and a lot of fun. So yeah, again, thanks everybody for watching, and I will see you in the next one.